to the to our noonish talk, our 12:30 talk. And this is an extreme pleasure to introduce Dan Fagre. He's a scientist up in Glacier, and he's been studying the effects of climate change, and he's extremely generous with his time. He makes many trips down here to Missoula to share his research, beautiful slides about what's going on in the crown of the continent up in Glacier. And one of the things about Dan is he's an excellent communicator of science. And many of his talks are just clear. And many of our discussions in the Debating Science program have been about communicating science and the ethical importance of communicating science. And Dan's done it so well that they're now trying to get him to say things about politics in big groups. Which is a no-no. But it's a real pleasure to introduce Dan, and I hope you enjoyed the talk.
Okay, thanks. Thanks very much. Well, I will be talking about the effects of climate change on Glacier National Park primarily, but we've, of course, partnered with people not only in the larger area, the crown of the continent, which includes Canada, but also the rest of the United States and ultimately the rest of the world. And obviously, it's appropriate to collaborate globally when you're talking about global climate change. And so it is really compelling to see that the same things that we are experiencing here in Montana are virtually identical to things that are going on in Switzerland, the Himalayas, or the Andes, and so forth. And I think when you start broadening the context in which you're talking about something, that's one of the best ways of communicating that this is not something that is focused on a person, a group, a specific geography, a specific problem or a resource, because that's the way a lot of people sort of personalize and take this message is how it's going to affect me. And so I think that's one of the first lessons that we've learned is we have to talk about this in the global context and look at the commonalities all across the world for people to realize this really is big and it's really important. So basically, we were tasked quite some time ago to start looking at a mountain landscape like this and figure out what makes it tick, how it's responding to climate change, and then try to use this information to project into the future because, of course, the park staff and the American public in general want to know what's going to happen to their protected areas. Now, mountains are really good for looking at climate change for a variety of reasons. The first is that they're really important to people. 50% of the fresh water that humans consume, and that's for irrigation and municipal water supplies, not just what you drink, comes from mountains on a global basis. In the American West, that figure is even higher. It's 85%. So we are very intimately tied to water coming from the mountains. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that mountains in general have experienced twice the climate change that flatland areas or the rest of the globe have on average. So temperatures have increased by a factor of at least 2 over some of the areas that we live in and that we're more familiar with and where we practice our agriculture and so forth. So the mountains are fairly sensitive to climate change, and the higher elevation in the mountains are even more so. And that's, of course, where a lot of our water is stored. And so we have this sort of paradox that we are, I think, dependent on mountains to a greater extent than we think. And now we're finding that mountains are more fragile, more sensitive than we previously thought. And of course, mountains are good for a lot of things besides just water. This is an area of high biodiversity, has high aesthetic value. There's a variety of reasons why mountains are important to people. And one of them, of course, is tourism. And so this is the Many Glacier Hotel in Many Glacier Valley, where there are no longer many glaciers. And so this typifies the kind of sense we have about national parks. The American public protected them. They put them aside, and yet climate change is influencing them and, in some people's view, is ruining them. And so this sense that we are basically helpless to protect our own national parks, which some people have said was the greatest idea America ever had, was putting aside national parks. That's now been copied all over the world. You know, people think that's a legacy that we've given the world, and yet here it's come back to bite us in a sense because we can't protect it from climate change. And of course, it's not just about national parks and protected areas. This is true from the standpoint of economics. And in the background here, the little white ribbon there is the Going to the Sun Road that goes to Logan Pass. And in the spring, which is in this picture here, even though it looks like winter, when that road is still closed, it costs the regional economy $2.2 million a day. So obviously there's a lot of pressure to get that road open as soon as possible, because these mountain landscapes are becoming more and more economically important to regional economies. In fact, there are several studies showing that under climate change, more people are going to be coming to mountains and wanting to buy vacation homes and move there and so forth, simply because the perception that they're cooler. And so under climate change, you know, mountains may get more visitors than ever before, just at the time when they're changing more than ever before because of climate change. Now, if we look around for, you know, a way to begin to sense how much climate change has influenced mountains, it's really difficult. You know, we were talking about this before I got started here. There are a lot of kind of abstract amorphous concepts. There's a lot of complicated spatial patterns. You know, this particular one here is an average annual total precipitation map of the United States. And one of the things you can see right off the bat is that you have broad color swatches in the eastern part of the United States. But in all the mountainous areas, you can tell exactly where they are. You have all of the complexity of the eastern part of the United States contained in each of those mountain areas. They're unbelievably complex climatologically. You know, and so you go around a bend in the trail, different aspects, you have different plants, things go up and down, it's very chaotic, and living in the mountains, I can verify that weather forecasting is pretty much still in the Stone Age. You can look out your window and see that it's different than what they're saying on the radio in real time. So mountains are very difficult. What do you do then? Well, one of the things that we did was we looked at the small alpine glaciers, and this one is Swift Current Glacier above my head here, and these are ideal for looking at the kinds of changes impacting the entire mountain ecosystem. For one thing, they don't adapt to anything besides climate. For all intents and purposes, that's just a physical manifestation of the climate laying on the landscape, because it's a balance of the winter snow that you get and the total precipitation and how much melts in the summer. And so if you have something changing in your climate, it's going to change these glaciers directly. And they can adapt, unlike plants and animals that can change migration or hibernate earlier or change what they eat. They're simply unable to do anything but reflect climate. They're also visual. You can see them, you can measure the margins, you can take pictures of them. People believe what they see. And so a lot of people who have said that climate change is not real have looked at glaciers shrinking and have had to be convinced that something was going on, because in many cases they're so vast that they have to reflect a global signal. Now, these small alpine glaciers, as I often joke, are also nonpartisan. They don't have a particular viewpoint, but people get most of their information through their eyes. We're very visual in our communication and our information inputs. And there's tons of studies showing that people see things and believe it before they'll hear things and believe it. In fact, if there's a dichotomy between the two, the brain chooses what it sees in most cases. And so there's an advantage there with photography, because people can see the change occurring very easily. Now, these small alpine glaciers also distributed all over the western United States, and so that makes them ideal as barometers of climate change. And you'll notice these are all on federal land. Nobody has a personal glacier in their backyard. They've never made it to the real estate development level, and they're well distributed. Nevada has one that's probably winked out by now. It's very, very tiny. It's still there? Good. And what you have then when we talk about the visual ways that you communicate climate change is things like this. This is Boulder Glacier, 1932. It was obviously we call it charismatic geological phenomena, because people love to come see these things. You can see the tourists there in the foreground. And then 56 years later, everything in that photo is gone. And in fact, not only is that vast ice sheet gone, but you actually have plants growing where that ice used to be. So in 56 years, you've had this enormous transformation of a landscape. Same thing for Cheney Glacier, there's a lot of these that we can look at. It used to go down into the valley, and now it's confined just to the higher reaches. Boulder Glacier, which we got last year, is interesting because this actually covered the entire Boulder Pass area, and a lobe of the glacier went down the other side there. You can kind of see it going behind that rock buttress. And in 1910, you know, this looked like you just come out of the little ice age, which you had, and yet by last August, you could prance around anywhere there. This is actually not even glacial ice anymore. That's just a remnant snowfield. And what's left of Boulder Glacier is actually too small to qualify as a glacier using the criteria that we use. So it's just a stagnant ice field. It's just a pathetic leftover glacier. And Grinnell Glacier from the summit of Mount Gould shows you that it's not just that they've been shrinking this way, they've also been thinning quite a bit. You'll see the red line where the ice was. It filled the whole basin in 1938. And now, of course, the ice level has gone down by hundreds and hundreds of feet, as well as having the glacier shrink by over half a mile. And as you can see, it's melting into its own pond. And you see all the icebergs have calved off the front of the glacier and are floating around there. And for reference, the waterfall that you can barely see over there is 450 feet high. So a number of hundreds of feet of ice had melted between those two photos. Now, if you look at where glaciers are being lost, where they're shrinking, it's not just us. We happen to be ahead of the curve a little bit. We're in the 66% area there. That's partly because we've actually warmed up more than other parts of the West by a small amount, and also our glaciers were very small to begin with, which makes them very sensitive to climate change. If you have a really huge glacier, you can have a number of other things going on with a large ice mass. That means it's slightly decoupled from the climate signal. You can have things like huge ice avalanches from up on a mountain come down, add mass to the glacier, and it kind of sends a slow motion pulse through that glacier, so it can actually expand during a hot period because of those ice dynamics. Our little glaciers don't have that luxury. They're just like an ice cube on a hot driveway on a summer day. No dynamics. Now, the interesting thing is that in the Northwest, the glaciers have been affected not only by warmer summer temperatures, as they have everywhere, but also by warmer winter temperatures. Now, warmer winter temperatures is kind of an oxymoron, because what we really mean is we're less cold. You know, people think about it, and it's not really warm. We're still cold, but it's just that we're less cold than we used to be. And that means that the snowpacks and the glaciers have more heat content. And so when you have a spring, and particularly an earlier spring, it's ready to melt a lot sooner. So you get a lot more melting occurring. So because of the warmer winters then, our glaciers are even more vulnerable than the ones in California and Colorado, which are also quite small. Now, this guy's saying stop the madness. And what we're actually doing here is looking at things besides glaciers. You know, people say, okay, so your glaciers are gone. Yeah, we're sad for you. But we need to look at other things that are also occurring in concert with the glaciers. Now, a lot of our large old-growth trees in Glacier National Park got started during that little ice age, around 1500. Many of these trees are 500 to 800 years old, and they can no longer reproduce in the climate in which they currently exist. So in other words, the seedlings that got established were established in a cooler, wetter time. And so once you have a tree that is well established and is older, it can handle a lot of climate change. And it can stay and persist through a lot of climate variability and even a complete climate shift. But what it can't do is reproduce. Okay, and so the seedlings for these species now are largely unable to survive the climate that we have now. So that's kind of key. And of course, forests have a way of keeping a little bioclimatic envelope going there as long as they have the structural ability to do so, but this is one of the things that takes that away. Now that we have more frequent forest fires that are larger in magnitude, particularly in the northern Rockies, we're seeing more and more of our landscapes completely converted. And once you have a complete conversion of that forest, what comes back is not the forest that was there. And so little by little we're seeing a biodiversity transformation that mirrors the reduction in our glaciers. And of course, one of the things that's coming back is lodgepole, which some people call those biological deserts. Just a kind of unending ocean of lodgepole is good for relatively few species and does not really promote the kind of diversity that we put these parks aside for. And so lodgepole are going to be one of the winners in climate change, and so are these guys. The pine beetles now have not only a lot more lodgepole to attack, they also have greater overwinter survival because the winters are less cold or warmer. So they start off with a larger overwintering population, and now because of the earlier springs and the warmer temperatures, they actually can have 2 complete life cycles in one season instead of one. So you've just put them on steroids. Their ability to grow is skyrocketing, and they have as much forest as they want. So what we've had then are some spectacular beetle kill events. The beetle kill in Colorado is now the size of the state of Rhode Island in just the last few years. In northern BC, they had a 3 million acre outbreak. Almost all the trees in this 3 million acre area are gone, or at least they're dead. And that's 3 times the size of Glacier National Park. And these are starting to occur in more and more parts of the West. Well, the concern is that as they're able to push northward because of a more benign climate, they can begin, they've basically had a barrier, an arid barrier here in the upper Great Basin areas. And if they interact with jack pine and move into that species, they basically are unimpeded to move across the continent to the east and ultimately down the eastern seaboard, where they're probably going to be able to use a longleaf pine and other kinds of pine down in the pine plantation area, which is where a tremendous amount of our wood products come from. So you can have a potential now for a continental scale beetle outbreak, which you never had before. At least from all the records that we have, this has not occurred before. They don't go back that far, of course. But this seems to be fairly unprecedented during the Holocene, based on what we know about the aridity they can handle and where they've traditionally been. And this is what it looks like afterwards. You not only have a lot of kill, which is a problem, but now you also have a lot of ground fuel for carrying even more fires. And so there are a lot of people that think that we will see a tremendous conversion of our forests on a continental scale as a result of climate change. Now, one of the compelling things you can do in communicating climate change, I alluded to before, and that is this repeat photography that you've already seen some examples of. And just to reiterate, no matter where you go in Glacier National Park, all the glaciers are showing basically the same thing. So very, very rapid retreat. So it's not just 1 or 2, it's basically every single one that we've looked at. And so the story is that 150 years ago, we had about 150 glaciers in Glacier National Park. Today we have 25. The largest glaciers, like Sperry here, are less than a quarter of the size that they previously were. And these glaciers have been on this landscape continuously for 7,000 years. So for 7,000 years they've been bigger than this, and they've shown most of this retreat in under 100 years, with quite a bit of it only in the last 2 decades. Now, one of the things we had to do besides do aerial photography was to get out and begin measuring the glaciers sort of in person, so to speak, because we started off thinking that we could do this every 5 years. And then we realized that the glaciers are going away so quickly that we wound up doing them every year. So we have a number of glaciers we're out on almost continuously, like Sperry, and then others that we're on about every other year. But we go along the margin with a GPS there, and part of the reason is that an aerial photograph would count that snow-covered rock potentially as being part of the glacier because it still looks white in the aerial photo. But once you go along the actual ice margin and hopefully don't fall in, most of the glaciers actually turned out to be smaller than we thought from aerial photography. So we've sort of upgraded our glaciological acumen here and gotten out on the glaciers more frequently. This GIS representation of Sperry Glacier, all this light blue stuff melted in a 2-year period, and all this gray stuff melted in a 1-year period. So the melt continues, and in fact, Sperry Glacier is losing about 8 to 9 acres a year now. Out on Grinnell Lake, I showed you a picture from above where it's melting into its own pond. we backpack these inflatable kayaks up. You can see the GPS unit on one of the kayakers there. And we go along the margin of the wall, and you can see how big it is. This is in the distance, so you have to take that into account. And you can see that the wall is considerably farther above this kayaker's head than you really feel comfortable with, given that these things occasionally calve off. And so we had a rescue boat, and Karen there is mostly willing volunteer. And we could GPS the margin of this glacier with such precision that by the time we went back down the trail, went back to our office, got the next day, had coffee, processed all the data, the glacier is already smaller than the margin of error on the GPS. It had melted more than the margin of error on the GPS. So it's a very dynamic sort of thing. And the glacier doesn't just melt in little drips and drabs. It sometimes does big things. This is an aerial photograph of Grinnell Glacier, most of which is in the shade here. And you can see that sort of rocky point out there and two big cracks in the back. And this was in late August of 2003. And when we visited it that next summer, that entire thing had broken off, which is about 5 acres. So nobody witnessed that, but on some September day before the lake froze over, that huge amount of ice broke off into 1 million icebergs. And some of those icebergs are still there. It takes a long time to melt an iceberg when the water is essentially at freezing. And so the Grinnell Glacier is going through this accelerated retreat because it's sort of calving into this lake. But it's thinning along one of the flanks as well. Now here's another photo that shows you the degree to which this is occurring for a small glacier. You can see in 2004 we had 166 acres, and 2006 153 acres, and that winds up being about a 9% loss for this glacier in 2 years. And so the area between the blue and the yellow lines represents where it broke off. But you also notice there's some over here in the lower corner that is on land, and it shows that it's melting there as well. Well, we also had to look at the depth of the glaciers, and so we just used some ice radar and bounced signals through the ice, and it tells you how deep the ice is. We're surprised that there's a pocket that is quite deep there, but if you look out on the right side, you can see that it's very, very thin. And I happened to just take a PBS TV crew up there, and we had to walk an extra 50 yards to get to the glacier this year because all of this thin stuff had melted in the hot summer last year. So we also use inspiration from NASA and the little Mars rovers, except we don't have that budget. And so we've improvised with a float tube, a fish finder, GPS, and taped together paddles, and backpacked that up there. And we needed to find out how deep the lake was. And so we sent another volunteer off. And I've made mention of how small these glaciers are. But when you're communicating some of these things to people, pictures tell a lot more than anything else. And you can see that with the perspective shift, he almost disappeared as a little speck. So even though that's a small glacier, small lake, it's still way big compared to people. The other interesting thing that I didn't realize was that we had a nice stiff wind that day, and icebergs move. And for a while he was trapped. The icebergs got around him and all locked him into a little open space between them, and he had to wait till they drifted apart. And so consequently, we were able to get our data, but he had to be out there almost all day and was very cold. However, when you take the depth of this water, which of course used to all be ice, you add the amount of ice volume that remains, and you take those repeat photos and you calculate how high the ice was on the walls before that, and you do a calculation, you realize that 90% of Grinnell Glacier is gone. Only 10% of this remains. And most of this melt occurred since this was made a protected area in 1910. So the glaciers are going quickly, and we have to look a little bit at the dynamics. And in spite of the smile on these people's faces, this is an all-day chore to dig about a 20-foot deep pit. And this is going through the snow on top of the glacier, and Karen in the photo there is standing on the glacier ice surface that we dug down to. And what we needed to do is get the depth and the density to look at the overall mass of ice and snow that is melting each year. And basically it's kind of like a checkbook account. And your income, in the case of a glacier, is how much snow you get and its water content. And that's the total mass input at the end of the winter balance season. And then how much goes away in the summer is basically your expenditures. And in the fall, you add this all up and find out if you have a negative mass balance, which is like going bankrupt, or you have a positive mass balance, which means you're making money, or in this case, you're making ice. And unfortunately, all of our glaciers are going bankrupt. And so when we go back up there and look at how much snow melted over most of the surface of the glacier, it was 100% of the seasonal snow, and that's what eventually makes the ice. And then we had about 5 feet of ice on average melt each summer that we've been monitoring. And if you take the depth of this particular glacier, Sperry Glacier, which is about 45 meters, and you divide it by 1 to 2 meters a year ice loss, you wind up with a figure that shows you that in the very near future, this glacier is going to be gone. And this basically corroborated this model we built in the 1990s with old data. And this shows what happened in the past with Blackfoot and Jackson glaciers, the white patches over here on the left side. And as we move into the future, you'll see very quickly what happens in the next 10 to 20 years. In 2030, that frame there, the 2 largest glaciers in the park are totally gone. Now, when we came out with this model in the 1990s, we thought, man, we're predicting that Glacier Park is not going to have any glaciers in our lifetimes. And we thought that was a little bold, since these glaciers had been here for 7,000 to 8,000 years minimum. They may have survived the Younger Dryas, which would make them even much older, thousands and thousands of years older. And that seemed pretty crazy. But we started looking at our data from the early 2000s, and we realized that this model was conservative. That we were indeed wrong, but we were wrong the wrong way from what we thought. In fact, we think we're about 10 years off. And so by 1998, the actual area for Jackson Blackfoot glaciers was substantially less than was predicted for 2 years in the future in 2000, 3.89, and actually wasn't far off of what we might have, according to the model, 2 years from now in the future. And of course, we've surpassed that by quite a bit. So we are about 10 years ahead of schedule on the melting of the glaciers in Glacier National Park, and we don't really see any particular end in sight. And part of the reason is that the temperature increases that we put in the model in the 90s was based on everything we knew about climate change at the time and was too conservative. The slope of our temperature increases in Glacier National Park has been double what we put in the model. And so that's what's been driving this increased rate of melting. Our precipitation has stayed pretty much the same. So it's only the increase in temperatures that's driving the melt here. Well, glaciers disappearing, as I said before, is a pretty compelling story in itself. This is one of the ways that we've communicated what's happening to the park to a lot of people, because the message is pretty simple. You know, it's ice and it's temperature, and it's going in one direction, and so people can get their brains around that. But it's harder to tell them how it's relevant to them. And so this stream gauge below Grinnell Glacier is one of the ways that that happens, because we start talking about water supply and impacts on human beings and so forth, and suddenly it's not just some esoteric glaciers up in the mountains. And in fact, when you start looking at the water in late summer, you realize that in many of these basins, all of the snow from the previous season is gone. So you have basically only some contained in groundwater and some soil moisture, but you don't have a lot of water left in the system. The reservoir of the annual snowpack is gone. And what keeps a lot of these little streams going is melting glaciers. The meltwater from the glaciers makes these base flow periods survivable for aquatic organisms. And what's happening is that we have completely lost glaciers in these basins. You see them blinking out one by one, the light blue ones. And those are the basins that have completely lost all their glaciers. And so they no longer have the buffer of melting glacier late in the summer. And that's critical to these organisms because even though they're kind of ugly, they are critical to the base food chain for aquatic systems, and they all have very, very specific temperature requirements. And so each species can only do well within one climate or temperature envelope, I should say, in the water. And so if the water temperature changes, they move up and down the streams, you know, until they make sure that they're in a good thermal regime. But you can see that what makes one happy is absolutely lethal for another. They can't complete their life cycle when these temperatures change too much. And so one of the things we did with the information we had on the thermal regimes of these organisms and what we think will happen to some of our streams once the glaciers disappear, we simply did a distribution model. And Pompeii Glacier here, as it melts, it's providing cold enough water to keep the red species going. And you can see the yellow one is down the valley bottoms where it's warmer, and it's pretty happy down there. Once the glacier disappears in the panel on the right, one species disappears entirely, and the green one is greatly restricted, and the yellow one makes out. And so, again, it's shows that there's a lot of flexibility and adaptability in the system, but it's not without consequences. So there are winners and losers in terms of animals in climate change, but what this does then is it cascades and causes changes in other parts of the system. And so if you look at the bull trout, which has been called the polar bear of trout species, it has to have very highly oxygenated cold water, and its distribution in the mountains is very much tied to this cold water. And so it will also be directly affected by warming water. It will also have its prey base affected by that because they're all connected and so forth. And to make matters more complicated then, the bull trout is also faced with the threat of introduced lake trout, which are aggressive competitors. And so it's getting a double whammy from climate change and introduced exotics, but it's not a real direct thing. It comes through these series of steps. So what it shows is that the aquatic organisms in the bottom of the valley are being affected by glaciers melting at the highest part of the mountain system. Yes?
Do these models take into account evolutionary change on the part of organisms?
The time frame for evolutionary adaptation in most of these cases is too short. But yeah, it's, in fact, I think I can show you another picture that shows why that's a problem. The bull trout, for instance, has a wide distribution but very limited adaptive capacity for warmer water. And so, and it's an old species, and so it's got a limit to the degree to which evolutionary mechanisms can help it adapt given the speed of the change of the climate and their habitat. So there's a mismatch there in this particular case. There are other organisms that can adapt much more quickly, and there's a lot to do with their genotypic plasticity and everything else. But in many, and actually I'll tell you a little story just because I remember it, and that's always important. The Nature Conservancy is actually has acquired some special habitat and has looked at the ability of the native fish to survive in that aquatic habitat and determined that there's absolutely no way that that particular species and that genotype will not survive there under even the most cozy of climate change scenarios in the future. And so they've decided to go and replace it with the next nearest thing. And so they're actively testing other genotypes to plant into this environment, because if they can't have what they want the next best thing. And I think that's part of the way in which we are going to be having to change our thinking about a lot of things. You know, this focus on endangered species, for instance, may have to become a little more negotiable. And of course, it's embodied in a lot of, a long history of legal and legislative constraints. And so it'll be very interesting to see how we being society, have to deal with some of these finite possibilities that we're going to be faced with. But with the bull trout, the fisheries biologist I work with says that when this perennial snowfield in Glacier National Park disappears finally, this habitat will no longer be suitable for the bull trout. So I trust that he's right. Now the bull trout, as I just said, is well distributed in the northern Rockies, and so one of the little models simply looked at what its distribution would be with different increases in temperature that raise the elevation in the mountains of the minimum that it can survive in. And so the current one you see has quite a good potential distribution based on water temperatures, but when you warm those up and only the coldest, highest reaches of the mountains have the temperature the bull trout can survive in, you can see in these three panels that when that's way high up in the mountains at 800 meters higher than it is now, not only do you have relatively little habitat, the other key thing is that it's highly fragmented. And so if you have an unfortunate event in some basin, they can't disperse back into that basin. They can't move down the streams because now they're too warm to get to a juncture and go back up into another basin where, you know, some landslide took out the lake or whatever. And so this makes them much more vulnerable, not only in having restricted habitat, but having it distributed poorly. And so that, again, getting back to your question, is one of the other things is how much helping do you do? You know, if we start trucking organisms all around, is that really the right way to deal with this or not? Is it going to be effective? And so, you know, there's no clear answers to that because we're still in the process of looking at a lot of just what the effects are. So anyway, I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to scoot along here pretty quick. Snow is king still, even though climate change is making things warmer. It's still plenty cold to snow. And there's other kind of subtle effects, and this is what I'm trying to look at as far as communicating the impact to the entire mountain ecosystem of climate change, not just the focus on glaciers, which is a compelling message, but we need to develop other compelling messages. And this one is another one whose story is fairly simple, so it convinces people that there are you know, fundamental shifts going on in this mountain landscape. These are strips of trees with interceding strips of meadow called ribbon forests, and these are really valuable habitat. If you go down to one of those meadows, it looks like this. And so it's got a lot of nesting birds and butterflies. Grizzly bears dig things up in it. You know, it's very much a verdant and fertile area habitat-wise, and it's bounded by these strips of conifers that basically aren't. And what we have now occurring is an invasion of those meadows by younger trees. And these trees in the foreground, which we've aged, are all 25 to 60 years old. And the trees right in the background, the tall spired trees, are 500 to 600 years old. And so something kept these young trees out of the meadows for hundreds of years. And that was during the Little Ice Age primarily, and it was primarily snow. Snow basically drowns small trees. They can't complete enough photosynthesis to stay alive. If you're under snow, they can't invade those areas effectively. And now that our snowpacks are thinner and disappearing earlier, we've made a new opportunity for these trees to invade. If you look at this particular photo below Pitamakan Pass in the park, this line denotes the older trees from the younger trees. And so you can see that in the last 60 to 80 years, we've had a flush of conifers moving up into the tundra as well as in those subalpine meadows. And when you have that, of course, you're beginning to reduce habitat for the animals that people care about. And so one of the things that makes for a compelling message in communicating climate change is relating it to things that are either directly and personally applicable to people or something that they intrinsically and emotionally care about. And you really can't get anybody excited talking about soil carbon. But you show them a picture of a young, vulnerable goat that everybody wants to hug, and you see the evil trees in the background starting to come up the slope, you realize that these are the messages that resonate. People are willing to listen to climate change stories when you have something like that. And about 4% of our alpine tundra habitat is now gone to trees in the last 50 to 60 years. Now, the other thing is that people understand temperature when they experience it personally. And so, you know, the old joke about everybody talks about the weather, but nobody does anything about it, is really kind of true here. You can see that the frost days have gone down enormously, meaning we have fewer days below freezing. And you can ask people about what they can grow in their gardens now. And I talk to people and say, yeah, I didn't grow this. And I mean, they're excited by the fact that they can grow new stuff in their garden. But then they realize, oh, that means climate change is real. In other words, it's personalized and so forth. And then when you look at extreme heat days, which we define as over 90, because a lot of plant physiology and other things change at that temperature threshold, you can see we have a somewhat of an increase in the extreme heat days as well. And again, that's what people tend to remember. You can't get anybody to tell you what an average temperature was 10 years ago or even an hour ago. They remember the extreme events. And so it's important to start documenting this because then they'll begin to realize that this is something they've experienced. The other thing is that, you know, I mentioned that we've had decreases in our snowpack. You know, you can actually look at statistics at things like snowmobiles have had a decline in sales for a long time now. You talk to skiers about how much snow they're going to have to ski when the snowpacks have been getting lighter and lighter for 50 years on average. And when you start talking about how early spring comes, this again is something that resonates with people because winters are still long enough here that when spring comes there's a sense of relief. And so being able to couch this in terms of what people experience is also very important. And people don't remember things very well, and so you have to provide some compelling graphics and everything to describe the fact that they're living in a different climate regime than they used to. And one of the ways we did this was look at the first day that you hit 90 and the last day that you hit 90 in western Montana, and that is going through time from 1890 to 2010 has almost doubled. So the length of time in which we can have 90-degree days is twice what it used to be. And one of the things that matters, one of the ways in which that matters, is that if you look at the extreme heat years, they correspond alarmingly well with great fire years. And so all of these red ones are years in which we had enormous fires, and you can see many of them line up perfectly with the extreme heat. And again, fires is kind of the sort of thing that everybody likes to stand around and watch, even the firefighters. And one of the things that you can start talking about is how this affects people, because almost everybody in Montana now has had a summer when they couldn't go outside and breathe, they couldn't jog because the air quality was so bad, their trails were closed. It's affected them personally in many, many ways. And interestingly, it's affected firefighters because now they're rethinking how they're going to fight these larger, more intense fires because they're seeing fire behavior they've never seen before. And so we have these incredibly flammable forests undergoing twice as much in terms of extreme heat, and you add those two together and you get some things that simply are outside the scope of the fire training that most people have seen. And so they've been pulling people back out of a lot of these situations now, which means in some cases that the fires are basically running on a head of steam on their own. In Glacier Park, we converted 13% of the entire 1,000,000 acres in 1 year, 2003, from stands of lodgepole in this case to landscapes like this. And so the visitor experience is now very, very different when you go there. And even though some people will dispute that climate change is the sole driver of fires, which it is not, it's still part of the background message that the environment is changing, that the way they used to see themselves in this landscape is changing. And so these are the kinds of things that, that they kind of undeniably internalize through time. Another thing that we've looked at are snow avalanches, and the coupling with climate change is a real interesting one. It's very complicated, but nonetheless it's something that affects people very, very directly. And so if you talk to the BNSF, Burlington Northern Santa Fe officials, they're scratching their heads as to why they're having so many more snow avalanches knocking trains off tracks. And this is the only route from Chicago to Seattle that carries the entire city's supply of chlorine for sanitizing the water supply for Seattle. So when the trains are knocked off the track here, they count it at about $1 million an hour until they get the trains running again. So this is not a trivial thing. It impacts society on a pretty large scale. So we began looking at a little bit more about avalanches from the standpoint of hazard forecasting and so forth under a changing climate. But we also recognize that these are vital ecological disturbance mechanisms, and these snow avalanches are keeping a lot of these slopes open and allowing the kinds of vegetation to exist that are absolutely important to things like grizzly bears. And so you can see in some of these areas here, the snow avalanched areas are green and provide excellent forage for a whole host of organisms. And they also provide a lot of other ecosystem services in that they bring nutrients from the tops of the mountains down into the streams and change stream chemistries and stream organisms and so forth. They're sometimes called bear elevators because the bears start at the bottom of the slope and they're in the avalanche chutes all day long. This is the place they like to be. So clearly when you start looking at preserving large carnivores, the link to what the snow avalanches do and the link to the changing snow dynamics and the link to climate change is yet another story that does two things. One is it's something, again, that people care about, but the other is it shows very clearly that it's not just a single two-part interaction, that you have these cascading events going out through the entire ecosystem. And so one of the things we did, just to hurry along here, was we used tree rings, and you can see the injury scars. You can date when it got whacked by a big avalanche, so forth. We found out, first of all, that there's twice as many avalanches as people thought they were. They are really important and very common. And the further up the slope you go, the more frequently you have avalanches changing the vegetation, as much as every 2.4 to 2.9 years. So it's pretty constant. And then when you look at this photo I showed earlier, and you start looking at the changing snow line, the smaller snowpacks, the earlier onset of spring, and the changing snow avalanche disturbance frequency, you realize that now we carry snow avalanches down to the valley bottom, but soon it'll be mid-slope, and eventually it'll just be the upper slopes. And eventually there won't be any. I think it'll be a long time till we're, you know, a rain-dominated and snow-free environment here, but we are certainly changing our ratio of rain to snow in favor of rain, and that's going to have consequences for snow avalanches. Yeah?
I'm just curious what the past couple of years have been like in the park.
For snow...
I know, say, I'm from Seattle, and the snowpack in the Cascades has been a lot higher in the past 2 years.
Well, last year was very good. This is the second best year we've had in 32 years, however. So it was an anomaly. And we actually didn't have too many big avalanche cycles this year. And it has a lot to do with the fact that we didn't have rapid warming. But typically, what we're moving towards in many parts of the U.S. is away from dry slab avalanches that occur more in the winter to basically we're getting springtime avalanches in November and January now. And so two things, rain on snow events and rapid warming, both of which are going to increase under climate change, are going to give us for a while the potential for greater snow avalanches, just at the same time that the overall snowpack, which you obviously have to have for avalanches, is declining. So there may be a window when we actually have greater snow avalanches and disturbance, but the writing's pretty much on the wall that eventually our benefits from snow avalanches, and I say that facetiously because some people don't think there are any, will go away. And yeah.
Well, along with all of this, with all of your models, are you taking into account albedo changes due to particulate deposition both from forest fires and also from industrial emissions? Or is that something you haven't looked at yet?
We haven't looked at that specifically. Tom Painter has looked at that in the Four Corners area, and that's mostly dust from farther west, and that has an enormous effect on snow melt rates and initiation, and also the timing of that seasonally.
Do you put that as a parameter in your modeling that?
We don't have to do that here yet. We looked at the amount of you know, obviously with forest fires, that's in the summer, so you don't really have albedo change in the snowpack. But we did look at whether it could impact the rates of melting of our glaciers, and the temperature increases far overwhelm any albedo shifts that we get. But that is a good point with regard to snowpacks and so forth. And then there's also positive feedback in that the earlier you get dark landscapes, then you have feedbacks to the snow melt rate, and it's a positive feedback cycle. So you get these thresholds, and also as your snow line goes up and you look at the relative amounts of landscape affected for each, say, 100-meter change in snow line, it's pretty vast, and so it tends to accelerate that too for the same positive feedback reasons. So anyway, this is one of the last slides. The other thing is that we get more extreme events, and this is the other thing that people remember, and so communicating climate change is a little dangerous when you hitch it to extreme events that can have multiple causes. But when you have people saying, yeah, we've had 3 1 in 500-year events in the last 10 years, and you know, they start talking about this in probability terms, and one of the biggest problems in communicating climate change is uncertainty, variability, and basically the whole concepts of probability. And that's one of the things that we have got to get across to people for them to understand how complex this is and everything. So anyway, so I'm going to just skip ahead here, and I'll show you some of the things that okay, first of all, one of the things that we've done is we put our repeat photography project on the web. We got 8,500 hits just in one day. We get about an average of 1,400 to 2,000 every week. Again, it's visual, it's compelling, and And these are some of the things that we've begun doing. We're doing, podcasts and animations and all these very visual graphics things that people like. We've partnered with artists, and I think this is something that has to happen, is that we need to get trans and interdisciplinary beyond just the usual ways in which we talk about that, but we need to have climate change messages embedded in art and literature and other kinds of things, storytelling traditions, the works. So we have to begin to look at different ways of communicating. One of the things that the park did was, about 2 years ago, it went from kind of not really being comfortable with climate change to embracing it as a central message. So this is a big flip-flop. And so now they have staff training, they have specific talking points and these resource bulletins and so forth. And if you drive the Going to the Sun Road, you'll see the model that you guys just saw here in 3 panels. You'll see some of my photos of glaciers disappearing. And these are wayside exhibits now where Joe Average America is driving their RV along, and they're looking at this, and they're looking at the shrinking glacier in the background. So there's a lot of ways that we can do this. A lot of scientists don't like talking to the media because you can pretty much be assured you're going to get screwed. But if you don't, you are also. And so I think that it's unfortunate we don't have a lot of science communicators amongst scientists. And I think that this is a career path that's going to have to take off. Science literacy in the United States is not particularly good when you compare it to, say, the Swiss. And I think regardless of how you compare it, we need to be better. We live in a very science-dominated world, and we need to start doing that to a much larger extent than we have before. So anyway, I ran a little longer than I wanted to, but I think that is something that we have to get out of our comfort zone to do. And I think that whether you are in a grade school situation as a science teacher and you're dealing with irate parents, you have to figure out what these messages are, and they're different for everybody. But I had a friend up in Canada who would go to ranchers who just hated the idea of climate change. And he wouldn't even talk about it. He'd go up to me and say, "So, how are things going?" And they just talk. He said, "Yeah, what's the weather been like?" "Oh man, the weather's so different than it was when I was a kid," and blah blah blah. And so they'd have like a 20-minute wine fest about this, and then you say, "So, climate's been changing." And I go, "Yeah, climate's changing." I'll end on that. Okay, I'd like to take some questions with the few minutes that we have left, because obviously this is something I can talk about all day long. So, yes?
How do you deal with sort of the bias that people have of more green means good? Because like the idea of, ice disappearing and trees going there, I think to some people the intuition is, well, that's a good thing, right? Because there's more trees.
Yeah, no, that's a very good point. And depending on who you are, it's probably true. And I think that one of the things to do is to honestly recognize that there are winners and losers. And for instance, the forest industry is going to be growing more trees faster for quite some time until we reach probably some moisture thresholds. But it's a change. It's not necessarily always. Change is not synonymous with being a catastrophe, and that's one of the things that we can use to talk about reasonably, so people start seeing it in a balanced way, and they don't think of it as just a polarized issue where you have to be for it or against it. And so one of the things that I do with that bias is I do talk about, well, that's a lot of fuel for fires. And fires in the American West now really dominate. I mean, it's on the news. I mean, first of all, we're getting bigger events, and so that's one of the reasons it's on the news. But I think to some extent we're also sensitized to that now. And so even smaller fires are reported when before they were more of local interest. And I think it's basically another visual sign of change. Glaciers going away is one, but these kind of spectacular events are another. And so you talk about more green eventually is more potential for fuel. You can talk about these beetle outbreaks, which are maybe a little behind forest fires in the public's awareness, but they're coming on strong. When I was down in Colorado, every night on TV, it's more shots of all their dying trees. The headline of one of the newspapers was a scientist talking about the fact that they think that this beetle outbreak is so severe there may not be quite literally a single remaining tree of that species left. And they're wondering if the beetles are going to jump to another tree species. So far they've been single species. And the reason that that was big news was not only, people see it wherever they're driving, but they made the very direct connection to hydrology and water and municipal water supplies and soil erosion problems and debris flows over roads. They made the link to people's everyday lives. And for that reason, I think that, they've got, in that particular case, they've sort of counteracted the green argument, and it's much more of a balanced resource discussion than just a green bias. But I agree, it's hard to tell somebody who's now able to garden in a way that they did in the past that it's all a bad thing. And for them, it's not. So, I think it's important to acknowledge that and say, yeah, that's good on this side, and then here's this on this side, and so forth. But yeah, in the back.
So in your last example with the rancher who acknowledges the differences from when he was younger, and still they deny climate change, why is that, do you think, that people deny what they see happening and don't associate that with global climate change?
Well, that's a $1 million question. And it actually has a very long answer, but I won't do that one. Essentially, I think that they have motivation to deny. I really think that most rational people, without a personal investment in any part of this, were simply to look at everything put out before them objectively. I don't think there would be any doubt that virtually all of them would see it as an issue and understand a lot about the causes and drivers. It's basically been made into a conspiracy and is become political, as you all well know. And you can do a lot with that, and there's a lot of ugly examples of that in history. I think that the lens through which we interpret anything, not just data, but visual images and everything, is really powerful. And so you have to find a way to attack that. And I was at a conference called Communicating Climate Change that the Colorado governor convened simply to figure out how to talk about this. And one of the social psychologists was saying that in about 20% of the population, they're essentially genetically constrained to a certain value system. And they cannot see beyond that. They believe things on the basis of values and principles, not on external stimuli. And they never will change on that. And they were basically arguing that, you shouldn't be trying to do that because you probably couldn't. Then there's another group that's also surprisingly large one. It's about 20%. And these are people that follow opinion leaders. And so, I've joked that if I could get Britney Spears to go on tour with me, I could instantly change like 50 million Americans' views about climate change if she said something. And I would spend probably 10,000 years changing the same number of people's minds. And so we have to think about that, and that's already been done. There are a lot of opinion leaders out there. Many of them know almost squat about climate change and the mechanics and the variability and even the arguments. They don't have to. All they have to do is be recognizable and say, I believe in climate change, and you've got a conversion. So that's, whether you think that's right or wrong, it's still something we need to be cognizant of in shaping messages. And then I think there is really a confused middle ground of another 20 or 30% where they are willing to think this through and put their biases and values on hold. That is the most valuable group to go after. In political terms, they're the swing voters, essentially. And I'll close with an anecdote, and then I'll stay here and answer anybody who wants to talk some more, because I think you're done at 1:30. I was giving a talk to an honors conference of high school students. Every one of those high school students was born after Al Gore held the first climate change hearings in Congress in 1988. And so I thought they're going to be hip and up on this, and I get some cool questions. And so, I did my song and dance and everything, and I was kind of looking forward to having these young people ask questions. Nothing. All their parents wanted to talk. And afterwards, it was the parents that came up, and I had this one woman in particular finally say, "Thank you for letting me believe." I went, "What? Do I look like a sage?" I didn't know what she meant. And what it was is she was grappling with this and was confused by all the countervailing arguments and all the disinformation stuff, and she couldn't sift out what was real science and so forth. And what it was is two things. One is I think that in my presentation I made it clear that I'm just looking at this and figuring it out. I don't have a political agenda. And two, I think honestly the fact that I had compelling visual evidence. And it kind of put her over the top where now she felt like she was given permission to believe this, and now she could start, you know, sifting through all those claims and everything. But I thought that was interesting that there would be that much angst in somebody trying to figure out what to think about this, that somebody could show them something and, quote, give them permission to believe it. So that got me to thinking a lot about communicating climate change. Before that, I was just telling stories about my research, and I've started thinking about more and more since then, and that's one of the reasons that we've done things like we've paired up with an art museum to create a global change art exhibit. And I think these are the kinds of things that we need to start thinking about. So thanks for your attention. I'll stay here if anybody has other questions.
Thank you.